Today, we are going to fix the biggest problem with the PS5. I know that looks are subjective, but to say the styling of the PS5 is controversial would be generous to say the least. And really, you could say the same thing about the PS5 Pro and the Slim as well. So today, we are going to completely re-engineer this system to make it poof, disappear. And in order to do that, we're going to utilize new cutting edge technology, some of which is completely new to me. And outside of just the looks, we're also going to fix some other gripes that I have with the PS5. Now, this is a project born of my own insecurity. I've gone to great lengths to hide the PS5 in my living room, but recently I was playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake and I just couldn't take my fiance's chuckling at all the cheesy dialogue. So I decided to relocate the PS5 up here in my office. But now I'm forced to look at it all the time. So I was staring at it, trying to come up with a solution when it struck me. Why not just do the same thing I did with my PC and hide it in my desk? Now, of course, I could just 3D print some brackets and stuff it in there, a little something like that, but that would be a thermal nightmare and probably kill my system. So let's tear into this PS5 and see if we can engineer a better solution. Based on how easy it was to remove the front panels, I was kind of expecting Sony to make the rest of the system equally easy to disassemble, but unfortunately, they took a page out of Nintendo's playbook and used security screws on the inside of the system. So make sure you've got a good set of precision bits on hand before tearing into your own PS5. I'll link one of my favorites down in the video description, along with all of the other tools and materials that I'm going to use throughout this video. Now, something you might not know about the PS5 is that there's actually 3 different revisions of the hardware. And I don't just mean the original Slim and Pro. Sony quietly made several revisions to the original design that changed things like the fan, the heatsink, and even the APU itself. Later versions of the system run cooler and quieter due to a more efficient APU design, but what I have here is the first version. So this thing is loud and hot, something that I definitely plan on fixing while we're rehousing this beefy game console. Okay, so now that we've got the PS5 all torn down, we've got ourselves a little bit of a problem. Normally at this stage of the project, I like to make a 3D model of all my parts so that I can work on a new design in Fusion 360. But this assembly right here, for lack of a better term, is really complicated. And to brute force measure that thing with a pair of calipers sounds like an absolute nightmare to me. So I got a new toy that should make that process a whole lot easier. This is the Creality Raptor X, and it promises to use 34 cross laser lines to create digital replicas of physical objects that are accurate down to less than the width of a human hair. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before we can scan anything, we have to do a little bit of prep. See, in order for this scanner to orient itself in a 3D space, it needs some reference points. So these little silver dots are tracking markers that do just that. I'm applying them to both this rotating base and these tracking towers that I printed over on my Bamboo Lab H2D. And Bamboo also happens to be the sponsor of today's video. But they told me to just skip the boring ad read that everybody's gonna skip anyways, and just focus on using the H2D to do something that's cool, ambitious, and encapsulates the maker spirit. So that is exactly what we're gonna do today. This won't be the last you see of the H2D because we're gonna be using it a lot, but I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let's just stay focused on the 3D scanning. What I've created here is a reusable 3D scanning workspace that I can use to scan all of my PS5 parts. And if this works, I have a feeling that I'll be using this for a lot of future projects as well. First up, I'm gonna scan the Blu-ray drive. Its gray color should make it particularly easy to scan, and yeah, as you can see, in seconds, it's already materializing on screen. As the scanner captures more data, parts of the model will turn from red to green, and capturing from different angles helps a lot, so you can see that I'm moving both the base and myself around to try and get as much green as possible. Unfortunately, the 3D scanner has no idea what you're trying to scan, so you do end up with a lot of junk data. So what I'm doing here is pruning away anything that we don't need, applying a quick optimization layer, and we are off to a great start. But as you probably already noticed, that's only half the model. because, well, a 3D scanner can't scan what it can't see. So I had to flip the Blu-ray drive over and scan its opposite side as well. Then in software, you combine both scans by selecting key landmarks. And even though it might look like a complete model at this point, there's still one last step. A post-processing filter is required to convert our cloud of millions of individual points into a solid mesh. Then, and only then, is it ready to be exported into your favorite 3D modeling software. Next was the PSU, and here I was nervous because a lot of 3D scanners will struggle when it comes to black objects. That's because the way most scanners work is by watching how the lasers reflect off of a surface, and, well, black absorbs most wavelengths of light, so there's not many reflections to observe. To give our scanner the best possible chance here, I closed the blinds, turned off all the lights, and then cranked up its power. And despite the challenging surface, the Raptor X actually managed to get the job done here, albeit at a slower pace. Scanning the PSU took probably twice as long as the disk drive, but hey, it was still way faster than measuring it all by hand. And then finally, the scan that I was the most nervous for, the motherboard and the heat sinks. Similar to black surfaces, reflective metallic surfaces are also really hard to scan, but for almost the opposite reason. These surfaces are so reflective that they can confuse the scanner. So to give it the best possible chance of working, I added a bunch of tracking markers directly to the motherboard. And it's worth mentioning that this is a method you can use to scan really large objects as well, the type of stuff that would be way too big for our reusable base. And you know what? Turns out I was right to be nervous. This one definitely took a while. The copper of the heat sinks proved especially hard to scan, but eventually, after multiple attempts, I got something that I think for our purposes is perfectly usable. It's not 100% perfect, but again, it's way better than anything I could do by hand. So the next thing I want to do is take those models and import them over into Fusion 360, which is my 3D modeling software of choice. Earlier, I created a model of both my desk and the drawer that's going to contain the PS5 by just hand measuring everything. There was no need for any fancy 3D scanning there. But when it came to importing my scans, the biggest challenge I faced was just getting them oriented in the new workspace. They seemed to get loaded in at some random angle, so I spent a few minutes adjusting each one manually until it was squared up in the workspace. And then I was ready to test and see if the 3D scanner is as much of a game changer as I'm hoping it'll be. The first thing I designed is a simple motherboard mount that will hold the PS5 inside the drawer. Using the 3D scan, I was able to line up all the screw holes, adjust all the mounts to the exact right height, and make sure that I didn't have any clearance issues. But all of that is predicated on my 3D scans actually being accurate. So I was crossing my fingers and holding my breath as I waited for the H2D to print my first prototype. And it's worth mentioning that I'm really utilizing the added capacity of the H2D here. There's not a lot of consumer 3D printers out there that could handle a print this large. Here we go. This is a very big moment of truth. Print looks amazing, as always with the H2D. Let's test this thing out and see how the 3D scanner works. Oh, okay. I like this 3D scanner. All of my screw holes are lining up perfectly. Everything fits exactly the way it did in the model. That thing is an absolute game changer and is going to make my life moving forward so much easier. Now, we are off to a fantastic start here, but this project is more than just a motherboard mount. So let's talk about a big problem that I have with the PS5. This thing is loud, especially during longer play sessions. And right here we have the culprit, the original fan. This thing is big and bulky, but honestly, doesn't move that much air, only 120 CFM. So what I want to do is replace it with this, a 140 millimeter Nocto fan. This fan will be way quieter and due to its more efficient design, uses something crazy like 90% less energy, which is a good thing because one of these fans only moves like 85 CFM. So I figured if one uses that little energy, well, then we shouldn't have any issue stringing 3 together in our new setup. This will move over twice the amount of air as the original fan and should be a lot quieter too. But in order to do that, we're gonna need to modify our drawer. I started by removing the walnut front panel. We're gonna set that aside and come back to it a little bit later in the project. For now, I just wanted to cut a large chunk out of the front of the drawer box. This will give us a bit more space for our fans, and importantly, later, it'll give us a good seal against that front panel. Now, of course, these edges are looking a little ragged, so over in Fusion, I designed a mount that will hold our two fans and cover those rough edges. This model has some floating sections, so I got to utilize one of my favorite features of the H2D, its dual nozzle system. One nozzle is fed with my main filament, and then the second nozzle is fed with a support interface. This dramatically reduces print times and kept the project moving along at a good pace. Actually, oh, easy release. Love to see it. Here, boom. Support interface, amazing. All right, there's our fan frame. And the installation couldn't be any easier. A series of screws held it down around the perimeter. One fan goes here, the other one goes here, and then the PS5 slides into position a little something like this. And with these two fans alone, we're already moving more air than the stock setup. But there's a pretty obvious problem. The PS5's heat sinks are all the way down here, so in reality, these fans aren't doing much to cool the system. So I was watching Optimum's video about how he used 3D printed parts to improve the cooling of his PC, and I thought, yeah, we could probably do something just like that here. So over the next day or so, I strapped myself into my desk and created what is essentially a really complicated snorkel for my PS5. I started with super simple geometric shapes that connected the front fans with the heat sinks. The idea here is to pull air through the snorkel and exhaust it out the front of the drawer. Once I had the basic shape down, I worked on refining my design by smoothing over any hard edges, adding screw holes where I could connect it to the front frame, and finally adding some runs to conceal the wires for the fans. But once I finished, I realized I had something that was way too big to print as a solid piece. Oh, crap. But that's okay, because this is a pretty common issue to run into no matter how big your 3D printer is. The solution is to just split your print up into smaller pieces. Now, I did have to go back and modify my design ever so slightly to add some small alignment points, but after that, I was good to go. And there's actually another really good reason to split your big prints up into smaller parts. If for any reason one of these prints fails, or I realize I want to go back and tweak my design, any reprints will take significantly less time. And time is important here, because even after splitting these parts up, they still took over 18 hours to print. Plus, you still have to reconnect everything. And here I found that CA glue does a fantastic job. Not only does it create a super strong bond between any 3D printed plastics that I've ever thrown at it, but you can also use an accelerator spray to have it cure in seconds. So one hand works as a clamp, the other operates the spray, and in less than a minute, you've got your part reassembled and ready to go. But I still had to check to make sure it fit both the front frame, which thankfully it did, and also the PS5 itself. Here we go, moment of truth. Does this go? Oh, look at that. We still have good access to all of our I/O over here. This section raises up perfectly to capture the full width of the heatsink. And honestly, I am pretty psyched on how this is fitting. But some of you are probably wondering about that third fan that I promised you earlier. Well, for this one, I want to do something that's really similar to the stock fan setup. Back over in Fusion 360, I designed a third fan frame that will allow our third fan to force air into the cooling system. So while the front two suck, this one is gonna blow. I printed it out on my X1 Carbon, removed all of the supports, and then test fit it in our new drawer setup. And thankfully, it slid right into position and looks great with the fan hovering just over the motherboard like that. But one thing that I haven't addressed yet is how we're gonna power 3 independent fans. And here, I've actually got some good news, because I don't think this is gonna be nearly as hard as it might initially look, provided you do a little bit of research first. Like I said earlier, the stock fan draws way more juice than these 3 fans combined. So there isn't really any reason that we can't just splice them into the original connector. The only slight hiccup is that Sony and Noctua do things a little differently. Sony has 3 wires, a positive, a negative, and a PWM signal that tells the fan how fast to spin depending on how hot the PS5 is. Noctua, on the other hand, has 4, because they also have an additional wire that reports how fast the fan is spinning. The PS5 doesn't really care about that though, so we can comfortably just cut off all of these green wires. And now the only challenge that remains is translating 2 different color schemes. Brown and yellow go together, black connects to black, obviously, and then finally our PWM wires are gray and blue. To seal it all up, I used a bunch of heat shrink tubing, and now, in theory anyways, we've got a super easy way to connect all 3 fans to the PS5. And yes, don't worry, this preserves the original PWM functionality, so our fans should only spin as fast as they need to keep the system cool. All right, that is it for our new cooling system. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of little rough edges here that I'm gonna continue to refine in the background, but at this point, I think we are ready to move on to fixing my next major gripe with the PS5. This is something that has bugged me from basically day one. The power and eject switch. In a brightly lit room like this, you can almost tell which is which. But by the time you put this thing in a home theater, they're basically indistinguishable. And the amount of times that I've hit eject when I meant to hit power or vice versa is absolutely ridiculous. So I think I've found a way to fix it, but it's not for the faint of heart. This PCB sits just behind the PS5's front panel and has 2 little switches for, you guessed it, the power and eject buttons. So we need to find a way to tap into this board and hijack its functionality. Analyzing it under the microscope revealed that this might actually be easier than I initially thought. This is looking like a pretty simple circuit. To bypass the buttons, I tinned up their contacts with some fresh solder and added a pair of wires to each one. These new wires will effectively allow us to close these switches from a remote location. So I went on Amazon and found these really nice looking brushed steel momentary switches and then routed each set of wires to its own switch. In theory, we should now be able to operate both the power and eject buttons from anywhere we want. Unfortunately though, we won't be able to test that theory until the whole system is completely rebuilt. So now that we have our newer, larger, and much more premium feeling buttons all wired up, we need somewhere to put them. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to fix another small issue that I have with the PS5. See, when this thing is vertical, it's really easy to find the disk drive. But I found when it was horizontal, the way I had it before, it's actually kind of confusing to get the right location for the discs, and I'd often end up trying to insert them somewhere here or there. So what I want to do is fix both of these issues at the same time. And the first thing I had to do was hack out even more of the drawer. The way the Blu-ray drive sits currently, you can't really access that slot, so removing this section should give us plenty of clearance. And then I also removed this area over here to give us somewhere to put the power and eject buttons. I positioned them close to the front edge so that you can easily get at them by just pulling out the drawer a few inches. Obviously though, just like before, I couldn't just leave the drawer in such a rough state. So back over at our 3D model, I designed a new 3D printed part that will hold our switches, cover up any rough edges, and importantly guide any Blu-ray discs effortlessly into place. I even embossed a Blu-ray logo into it so it's exceedingly clear where any disc should go. And of course, I also did the same for the power and eject buttons because, well, somebody needed to make it clear which is which. So while I waited for that part to print, I embarked on another little side quest. Seeing as I'm designing what is essentially a naked PS5 where all the internal parts are exposed, I thought it might be fun to dress some of them up. And since the aforementioned Blu-ray drive will be front and center, I decided to give it a fresh coat of copper metallic paint. That way it matches the exposed copper heatsinks. And just then, in a coincidence of timing so perfect that it could only be the result of movie magic, our latest part finished printing on the H2D and was ready for a test fit. The new switches slotted right into place, and our new Blu-ray guide fits in position like so. Oh man, I am really happy with the way this is looking so far. But now we have to do something that I've been dreading. I do all of my prototyping in PLA filament because it's cheap and easy to print, but it's far from the strongest material, and that's doubly true once it starts to get warm, the way, you know, it might with a game console. So what I really want to do is reprint all of our parts in ABS. It's stronger, more heat resistant, and it's what Sony uses for their PS5 case. But ABS has one rather large issue. It shrinks as it cools. This causes it to warp, twist, and oftentimes completely separate from the build plate mid-print. In the past, I have had a lot of issues trying to use ABS. So that is why I was quite intrigued when I saw that Bamboo recently added this new glass fiber reinforced ABS to their store. They claim that the addition of glass fibers dramatically reduces shrinkage and simultaneously makes the filament even stronger. Now, that sounds like a win-win to me, but I'm a little bit skeptical based on my previous experience. So what do you say we put this stuff to the test? And I actually forgot to mention two other quirks of working with ABS. The first is that it prints a lot better with a heated chamber, which thankfully the H2D has, but it also means that I can't open the door to film what's going on inside, so B-roll is kind of limited here. And the other thing that's important to note about ABS is that it actually releases toxic fumes as it prints, so even though the H2D has a built-in air filter for exactly this reason, I still figured that it was better to play it safe and monitor these prints remotely while we pick up a thread from earlier. One thing I want to do is to make this drawer panel front piece match my other drawer panel front piece. And in order to do that, we are going to use my CNC. Now, I'll be honest, this is not really my ideal solution. We need to create an exhaust grill in this panel, and based on my previous design, I kind of felt like I had to make this one match the old one, which is probably a little bit restrictive in terms of airflow. Now, I'm probably overthinking this because my 700 watt PC runs cool and quiet, but I am considering completely redoing both in the near future, so get subscribed if you want to see me crank my desk PC up to 11. Anyways, this recessed area on the back side should help to balance out airflow and at least partially compensate for the restrictive design. I sealed the wood using the same finish as before, so it all matches nicely, and then I turned my attention to the PS5's RF shielding. Just like with the Blu-ray drive, this is going to be front and center, so I sprayed on a coat of dark metallic paint that I think looks really cool. And with that, we were ready to go check on our glass fiber reinforced ABS and see how it printed. It's been a long time printing, but we are finally ready to see if this ABS GF is all it's cracked up to be. Let's crack it open and wow. Okay, this stuff is fantastic. Not only are these just really nice prints, but they also have a really fine texture to them, the same way you might get with like a carbon fiber filament that basically makes any and all layer lines completely invisible. These are such nice parts. So I printed this obviously with ABS support as well. So let's see how easy it is to remove any of these supports. That is, oh, that's so easy. Oh, okay. You know what? ABS may have just gone from my least favorite filament to now being one of my favorite filaments. Okay, so I'm gonna keep removing all of these supports, but while I do that, I think we should also get started on printing the rest of these parts, because to reprint everything is probably gonna be at least 24 hours of solid printing. Now, even though what happened next happened over the course of many days, we're just gonna breeze right through most of it because, well, you guys have already seen all this stuff before when I printed these parts in PLA. But there are a couple of key differences. The first one was that I could now permanently install that walnut front panel. And here I'm using the old cabinet maker's trick of double-sided tape. It can actually be pretty tough to get the gaps to align perfectly between different panels, so I used some business cards to set the gap, then the tape held the panel in place temporarily while I screwed it permanently in place through the front intake. This locks everything together and creates a nice tight seal. And then we have our motherboard tray, which has changed really significantly since the last time you saw it. The first change you'll notice is some mounting points for both of the front panel's PCBs. I also included these little dovetails on the tray so that it locks perfectly into position with the fan manifold. This ensures that everything is exactly where it needs to be while I screw it to the drawer. But you're probably wondering why I added all these walls and cutouts to it as well. Well, the cutouts are just there to cut print time, but the walls serve a much more important function. They're there to make sure that all the air from our third fan gets directed towards the PSU and the heatsink. And speaking of that third fan, I also added this little cutout to its frame so that I can mount the PS5 status LED. That way it'll illuminate the fan and we can still get that same functionality. Now, before installing the motherboard, I decided to steal an idea from Sony. I noticed that the PS5's original case made ample use of foam tape to help channel air, so I decided to do the same thing. This will further ensure that all of our air ends up going where we need it to go and that our system stays nice and cool. And speaking of staying cool, a really common mistake I see people making is reusing the same thermal pads when reassembling a game console. It's always a good idea to remove the old ones and replace them with new pads, but why not do one better and give the system a little upgrade? You guys know that I'm a big fan of K5 Pro because it's more thermally conductive, and because of its cream cheese-like consistency, you have way more surface area to dissipate heat. So this is yet another small little upgrade for our system. From there, it was pretty much a straight shot to reassemble the console. Well, except for right here where I made a rookie mistake that I'm gonna have to correct later. I screwed the fans in place, plugged in the antennas, connected my new metal buttons, which by the way, I still haven't tested yet, and gave my PS5 one last upgrade in the form of a 2TB SSD for storing all of my games. I also attached this copper heatsink to it because, well, I thought it looked pretty cool. After sliding the drawer back into my desk and connecting the two lone cables, I realized I had one last job for my H2D. I printed out some simple little cable clips that should keep both of these secured in place and prevent them from getting snagged whenever I close the drawer. And at this point, I was almost ready to test the system, but I figured I'd better fix that mistake from a second ago. There's actually just enough space to route the fan cables under the Blu-ray drive and create a much cleaner aesthetic. And then, after all of that, I was finally ready to test the system for the very first time. Here we go, big moment of truth. Oh, yes, it actually works. Oh man, that is such a relief. Remember kids, you should test your mods one at a time instead of waiting and doing them all at the end like I have. So now that I know that it turns on, let's do a little bit of testing and make sure that everything's actually functioning correctly. The first thing I want to test is sound. Just how quiet is our new PS5? Well, turns out it's very quiet. At idle, it's hovering around the low 30s, and sometimes it dips so low that it can't even be measured. And then after an hour or so of gaming, the fans do pick up a bit and it starts peaking into the 40s. Now, stupidly, I didn't measure any of the sound levels before starting this project, but qualitatively, I can tell you guys that this is a night and day difference. Once you start playing a game, there is no way you're gonna hear a peep from this PS5. I also spent a good bit of time analyzing the system with a thermal camera, and everything is well within spec, even after the system has been running for a long time. You can really see that new cooling system putting in work too. It's just dumping heat out of the front of the case, and the entire run of it warms up pretty significantly, which is exactly why we printed all of these parts out of ABS. Now, I'm sure there are people out there who are curious about Wi-Fi performance and controller reception now that the system is essentially encased in wood, and here too, I'm happy to report that everything is working great. I'm getting over 300 megabits down, and controller reception seems completely normal even from the other side of the room. So overall, I am thrilled with how this project turned out. The system is completely invisible to anyone who didn't watch this video. It's whisper quiet, all of my gripes about usability have been solved, and it still plays just as well as it ever did. There's really only one major issue that's been bugging me since I finished. I went to so much effort to hide the PS5 because, well, I didn't care for its original design, that I didn't stop to consider that I might actually like the way it looks once I was done. There's just something so cool to me about this stripped down utilitarian design that I almost feel bad hiding it away in a drawer. And while we're on the subject, there are a couple of other things that I think I probably could have done differently to make this project even better, and I'm gonna cover those in a separate bonus video for channel members. So check that out if you're interested, and big thank you to Bamboo Lab for making this whole project possible. I honestly would not have wanted to attempt a project like this with any other 3D printer. All right guys, that's it for me, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.